Before Rick James became the funk icon behind Super Freak, and before Neil Young became one of rock's most influential songwriters, the two shared a little-known chapter of music history right here in Toronto. That chapter was about a short-lived but fascinating band called the Minor Birds. It was the mid-1960s with a teenage Rick James, born James Ambrose Johnson Jr. in Buffalo, New York, when he joined the U.S. Naval Reserve in an attempt to avoid being drafted into the Vietnam War. However, when he was called to duty and transferred to the USS Enterprise, James made a life-altering decision to flee the country and escape north to Canada. Toronto, in particular the Yorkville neighborhood, was a perfect place to disappear. At the time, it was known as the music mecca of Canada, filled with artists, musicians, and counterculture energy. Not long after arriving, James was attacked by a group of people who recognized him as a draft dodger. But at that moment was where he was rescued by a group of musicians. One of them was Levon Helm, a future member of the band. That same night, James joined them on stage, marking his first entry into Toronto's music scene. At the time, he was performing under the name Ricky James Matthews and quickly began forming connections with other Toronto musicians. He joined a group called the Sailor Boys, alongside musicians like Nick St. Nicholas and Goldie McJohn, both of whom would later become members of Steppenwolf. Eventually, the band caught the attention of a nightclub owner named Colin Kerr, who became their manager and convinced them to rename themselves after his pet bird, the Minor Birds. Despite early performances and even releasing a single, the band didn't achieve much commercial success at first. But early in 1965, Bruce Palmer replaced Nick St. Nicholas on bass, while the other members of the original band left to pursue different projects. What remained was essentially rebuilt from the ground up, with Rick James and Palmer forming a new version of the Minor Birds and steering the band in new creative direction. Then, in 1965, Rick James saw a young, struggling folk musician performing in a Toronto coffee shop, Neil Young. Recognizing his talent, James invited him to join the band, and this changed everything. With Young on board, the Minor Birds developed a unique sound, a fusion of R&B, soul, and folk rock. It was an unusual combination at the time, blending James' Motown-influenced style with Young's folk and country roots. The band quickly gained attention, and soon they achieved something rare for a Canadian group in that era. They signed with Motown Records. Under the guidance of Smokey Robinson, they traveled to Detroit to record music. Songs were written collaboratively, including I'll Wait Forever, one of the only known co-writes between Rick James and Neil Young. At this point, it seemed like the Minor Birds were on the verge of becoming something big, a band combining multiple future legends, backed by one of the biggest labels in the world. But everything fell apart. Their manager had secretly taken the band's advance money from Motown. When confronted, he retaliated in the worst possible way. He revealed that Rick James was AOL from the US Navy. Motown immediately halted the project. James was arrested and returned to the United States, where he spent about a year in a naval prison. With their frontman gone and the record deal destroyed, the Minor Birds collapsed. Neil Young and bassist Bruce Palmer, unsure of what to do next, made a spontaneous decision and drove to Los Angeles. This decision would lead to the formation of Buffalo Springfield, one of the defining bands of the late 1960s. Meanwhile, Rick James would eventually return to music, launching a solo career in the 1970s and becoming a global star. Looking back, the Minor Birds represent one of the greatest what-if stories in music history. A band that brought together Rick James, Neil Young, and future members of Steppenwolf, all in one place at one time, signed to Motown, experimenting with a genre-bending sound that was ahead of its time. But due to one secret, one moment, and one decision, it all disappeared before the world ever got to hear what could have been. Still, the story remains a powerful reminder. Sometimes, history's most important moments aren't the ones that succeed, but the ones that almost did.